Okay, biology, I'm going to try this one more time. My last recording cut out, and then I did another one the wrong way, so we'll see if this works. Hopefully a thumbs up. Alright, so we left off in the last video talking about genetics and how DNA is basically what we'll study in genetics. We'll study our genes and how genes are passed down through generations, and we'll track genes through generations. We'll talk about genetic disorders, whether if they're gene mutations or if we see chromosomal mutations. So we'll talk about genetics, and we'll basically, track genes through generations. Then we'll talk about, along with genetics, we'll talk about growth and development, because when we talk about growth and development, we typically are going to talk about, or at least in this class, we're going to talk about how genes are passed down to offspring. And so when we do that, we'll talk about different types of reproduction, where we have asexual reproduction, and we'll focus on mitosis. So mitosis is basically a cell, so let's say this is a human cell, creating two identical daughter cells that have the same amount of chromosomes in them. So we have the 46 chromosomes here, and we call that asexual reproduction because you have one parent. So one parent making identical copies of each other. Then we have sexual reproduction, so we need two parents, and so this is where we'll get into genetics and how genes are recombined or they're mixed up in order to make you, and you're different from your brother and so forth, unless you're identical twins. But basically, we'll talk about meiosis for sexual reproduction and how our gametes are formed. So in a female's gamete is the egg, a male's gamete is going to be the sperm. And our gametes, they need to have half the number of chromosomes. And in order to do that, they go through a process called meiosis. Now, the reason why they need to have half is because if they have 46 chromosomes and then fertilization happens, our new cell or our zygote is going to have way too much DNA, and it stresses the cell out having that many instructions, and then it goes through apoptosis, and so it'll basically destroy itself. So all of our cells, they want to have a perfect number of chromosomes, and so that's why we have to go through meiosis to create these gametes, so egg and sperm. After fertilization, then we have the proper number of cell or chromosomes that the cell needs in order to replicate itself and turn it into a new human being. So we'll talk about sexual reproduction for growth and development. After we talk about that, or actually throughout the whole year, we'll kind of focus on this topic called homeostasis. Homeostasis is, again, just maintaining a stable internal environment. For instance, when you guys, and we've talked about this in class, when you get cold, your body shivers. You want to heat up your body, so you shiver, and you use energy to try and heat that body up. So you want to try to maintain that internal environment. When you're hot, you sweat, so you want to cool your body off. And so that is basically homeostasis. The same thing happens with water. You want to maintain a certain amount of water in your blood. You want to make sure that we have a certain pH, so we're a neutral pH. We're not too acidic, we're not too basic. And then also, so temperature, water, pH, and we'll talk about other parts, how like ecosystems kind of maintain homeostasis. So like a perfect number that keeps an ecosystem like in balance with each other. Then we'll talk about evolution and how species change over time. And we'll specifically talk about how species change over time and not organisms. So organisms, they do grow and develop. They do change over time. However, something that you acquire in your lifetime, like let's say you're, lifting weights, you're really gaining that muscle. If you were to have a child, your baby isn't going to come out muscular. It's not going to have that ability. So evolution is a change in species over time, not necessarily a change in organisms over time. And so we'll talk about how species change over time, and we'll bring in Gregor Mendel's idea of genetics along with Darwin's ideas, and we'll mesh them together and talk about how scientists look at evolution today versus the way they looked at them in the past. And then last but not least, before we get into our rat dissection, we'll talk about ecology. And in ecology, you'll hear this word called interdependence. Now, interdependence is basically the idea that everything's connected. So what I do in my life has an effect on everything else. So when we talk about ecology, we're talking, and you hear that word, that eco, it means house. So we're going to talk about our basically world as a living system. Okay, and so we'll talk about the biosphere and all the living things things inside the biosphere and how biosphere, the living parts, have an effect on the atmosphere and everything else. We'll talk about how living things need matter and energy in order to survive, and we'll talk about how each trophic level gets their energy. And so ecology is the way we're kind of going to finish up our year. And so this is basically, you want to have this copy down in your notes. It's just a nice little picture that maybe will help you study for your test. You will have to know the big ideas of biology, focusing mainly on these big ideas because they're the ones that we're going to focus on the most in this class. If you have any questions, just let me know. Hopefully this homework assignment was